Welcome to the Dark Paradox Podcast, the show where we dive deep into some of the most perplexing cold cases in history, unraveling mysteries that have baffled law enforcement and the public for years. In today's episode, we're going back to the late 1950s, to a small town in Illinois, where one of America's oldest cold cases unfolded. This is the story of Maria Ridulph, a case that gripped the nation, went cold, and decades later saw a surprising twist. Our story begins on December 3, 1957, in Sycamore, Illinois. Maria Ridulph was a 7-year-old girl with bright eyes and a warm smile. She lived a typical mid-century American childhood, filled with school days, playtime, and family. But on that chilly December evening, the unthinkable happened. Maria vanished, setting off a chain of events that would haunt her family, the town of Sycamore, and the entire country for over half a century. Maria, along with her friend Kathy Sigmund, now Chapman, were playing outside in the first snowfall of the season. As the twilight turned to darkness, a young man approached them. He introduced himself as Johnny and offered to give them piggyback rides. Kathy briefly went home to fetch mittens, and upon her return, Maria and the mysterious Johnny were nowhere to be seen. Maria Ridulph had disappeared. The search for Maria was swift and extensive. Local police, the community, and eventually the FBI, led by Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, got involved. President Eisenhower was informed, and the case made national headlines. It was one of the largest manhunts of the time. But despite the massive efforts, days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, with no sign of Maria. Then, on April 26, 1958, nearly 5 months after her disappearance, a tragic discovery was made. Maria's body was found in a wooded area over 100 miles away from her home. The initial investigation saw various leads and suspects, but nothing concrete emerged. The case slowly turned cold, leaving unanswered questions and a community in despair. It wasn't until decades later, with the emergence of new evidence, that this story would take a shocking turn. The disappearance of Maria Ridulph was more than a local news story. It became a national sensation. In the 1950s, child abductions were not as commonly reported in the media as they are today, making this case particularly shocking and heart-wrenching. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, took a special interest in the case. Agents from the Chicago office were dispatched to Sycamore, turning the town into the epicenter of one of the biggest investigations of the era. Kathy Sigmund, Maria's friend and the last person to see her, became a key witness. She described Johnny as a young man in his early 20s, with bad teeth and a gap between them. Despite Kathy's description and multiple leads, the suspect remained elusive. The FBI interviewed over 100 potential suspects, but no arrests were made. The case was challenging, with limited forensic technology, and no clear motive or suspect emerging. Then, on April 26, 1958, a tragic discovery shifted the case from a search and rescue mission to a murder investigation. Maria's body was found by a couple hunting for mushrooms in a wooded area near the town of Galena, Illinois, over 100 miles from her home. The discovery was a devastating blow to the community and the nation. However, even with this grim discovery, the leads were sparse, and the case grew colder as the years passed. In the decades that followed, the Maria Ridulph case became a haunting memory in Sycamore. It seemed destined to remain an unsolved mystery, a case study in the limitations of mid-20th century law enforcement techniques. But the story was far from over. New developments in the 21st century would breathe new life into the investigation, leading to unexpected twists and turns. The Maria Ridulph case lay dormant until a stunning revelation in 2008. The key to reopening the case came from an unexpected source: the mother of a former neighbor, John Tessier, later known as Jack McCullough. On her deathbed, she made a statement to her daughter that implicated Jack in the disappearance of Maria. This revelation prompted Jack's half-sister to bring the information to the police, reigniting interest in the case. The authorities began re-examining the evidence with fresh eyes and modern technology. They realized that Jack Tessier, who lived near Maria in 1957 and matched the description given by Kathy Sigmund, had been previously eliminated as a suspect based on an alibi. He had claimed that he was in Rockford, Illinois, trying to enlist in the Air Force at the time of Maria's abduction. However, upon reviewing the case, investigators discovered inconsistencies in McCullough's alibi. The timestamps on the train ticket and collect call he made from a payphone in Rockford didn't align perfectly with his story. This, along with Kathy Sigmund's identification of McCullough in an old photograph as resembling Johnny, led to his arrest in July 2011. Jack McCullough, now a retiree living in Washington state, was charged with the abduction and murder of Maria Ridulph. His trial in 2012 captivated the nation. It was a trial that hinged on decades-old memories, a questionable alibi, and the pursuit of justice for a crime committed over half a century earlier. The trial of Jack McCullough commenced in 2012 in Illinois. The prosecution's case was built largely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of Kathy Chapman, who had been Maria's playmate on that fateful day in 1957. Now an adult, Kathy testified that McCullough resembled the man who introduced himself as Johnny and played with them just before Maria's disappearance. Another key piece of evidence was the questioning of McCullough's alibi. The prosecution argued that the timeline he provided for his trip to Rockford for a military physical examination was questionable. They suggested that he could have had enough time to commit the crime and still make the trip to Rockford. However, the defense countered, stating that the evidence was too weak and relied heavily on aged memories and circumstantial connections. They argued that the timeline, while tight, was not impossible and maintained McCullough's innocence. The trial was a tense and emotional affair, with the defense and prosecution painting very different pictures of what might have happened over 50 years prior. In the end, on September 14, 2012, the jury found Jack McCullough guilty of kidnapping and murdering Maria Ridulph. He was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was seen as a victory for those seeking justice for Maria. However, this was not the end of the story. Doubts about McCullough's guilt and the integrity of the investigation would soon surface, leading to an extraordinary turn of events. In the years following McCullough's conviction, questions began to surface regarding the evidence and the fairness of the trial. A new state's attorney, Richard Schmack, took a closer look at the case and found significant issues. Schmack stated that telephone records from the 1950s, which were not thoroughly examined during the trial, indicated that McCullough had indeed made a collect call from Rockford around the time of Maria's abduction, supporting his alibi. Furthermore, Schmack pointed out that the timeline for McCullough to have committed the crime and traveled to Rockford was implausible. The new analysis of the evidence suggested that McCullough could not have been in Sycamore at the time of Maria's disappearance. In a stunning turn of events, on April 22, 2016, Jack McCullough was released from prison after his conviction was vacated. The decision was controversial, with some believing in his innocence and others convinced of his guilt. McCullough maintained his innocence throughout, and after his release, sought to clear his name completely. The aftermath of McCullough's release reignited debate over the case. It raised important questions about memory reliability, the use of circumstantial evidence in cold cases, and the challenges of ensuring justice in crimes committed decades earlier. The Maria Ridulph case remains a haunting and complex story. It reflects the evolving nature of criminal investigations and the enduring quest for truth and justice. As we conclude today's episode, we reflect on a case that, despite its twists and turns, leaves us with more questions than answers. Thank you for joining us on Dark Paradox. We hope this journey into the past has provided insight into one of America's most intriguing cold cases. Stay tuned for more stories of mystery, history, and the pursuit of truth.